Greetings, everybody. Is it still morning? Morning. I'm happy to have this, what I'm calling a veranda chat with Eddie Baugh, whom I don't have to introduce, but this is a great pleasure and delight for me to sit here with him. And I am looking forward to this conversation, and especially to hear him read, and then we'll reflect on some of the poems and his life as a poet and as a critic, and many other things that we'll try to get into. So I'm going to sort of save the formal kind of introduction and jump right into talking to Eddie Baugh. One of the first things I want to ask him is one of the things that I know he doesn't like to be asked, based on some of the poems in Black Sun, his collection Black Sun, and they're poems that deal with the speaker's dislike for interviewers. So I have that odd pleasure at the moment. And in one of the poems, it deals with this question that an interviewer asks the speaker: how do poems come, right? So I want to ask Eddie that question, but I want to ask him to respond to the question when poems first started coming to him, and what kind of circumstances brought them on and made him want to be a poet.
Thanks, Ishion. Exactly the kind of question I don't like to be asked. Well, there are two things, but I suppose the first is, when did poems start coming and what brought them on? I don't know where they came from originally. I give all sorts of answers. That may be listening to parsons preach from the pulpit, good sermons on a Sunday when I was a little boy, reading the Bible, the book of Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Then, just to remember, the first time I can remember writing a poem, the Gleaner, the newspaper in Jamaica, had celebrated some anniversary of the city of Kingston, and they had a poetry competition, and I entered a poem. I was at school, and lo and behold, the poem won second prize. And I still kept the check which I got, which I think was a guinea, if you know what a guinea was. And it was a long time before I cashed it. And then, obviously something was in me that I didn't know was there. But it wasn't until I got to university at Mona and became involved in our literary society and scribblers group that one or two other poems started to come. And then eventually there came a time when I said to myself, and one was broadcast on the BBC Caribbean Voices on Sunday evening, and I didn't even have the pleasure of hearing it. And then I said to myself, and maybe, man, maybe you will be a poet. So gradually it took its shape. Unfortunately, I never had the indulgence of continuing on a roll of poetry. Sometimes what I'm calling a roll would begin to come, would start, but because I have a great sense of responsibility, not just to poetry, but to my job, which was not poetry. And especially when I was head of department, and you had to meet students and mark their papers and sit in committee meetings, I would give up, I would break the roll that was coming and then lose it. So that if I had had the courage of dedicating myself, committing myself fully to writing poetry, I may have been a better poet and may have been in a better position to answer these questions this evening.
You see the humility? And this is one of the reasons I love Eddie Baugh so much, and I take him as an example. We were born in the same town, only 2 years apart. As you're talking about that role, when the poems come, and because Eddie's output isn't, in terms of the poetry, isn't large, so to speak, but each poem is, I believe, its own masterpiece, and that's why this slim volume is so important, and in our Caribbean literature. But as far as poetry goes, and I would encourage everybody to pick up a copy. If you don't have it, I would be shocked if anybody here doesn't have a copy. But I wanted to also return to the writing of poems, because a lot of the poems themselves address the craft of poetry and the dilemma of making poetry, which appears to be, and you use one of the words there, responsibility, a sort of ethical responsibility. I wonder if that is a fair sort of way to think about the art of making poetry as a sort of ethical responsibility, something you feel charged with from the standpoint of a sort of a moral ground.
You said ethical?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if it's an ethical responsibility. I know it's an artistic responsibility, which will obviously convey, and no doubt will convey, will carry with it whatever we might call ethical dimensions and moral and socially responsible dimensions. I'd like to think, when I'm talking to other people who say they've written poems and can I look at their poems, what I'm looking for and trying to tell them is that, of course, you get a poem, but the poem must somehow make a difference. So however one defines that difference, that idea will convey whatever sense of responsibility that I think I have, or the poet should have, to writing poetry. But yes, we could call it ethical. Yes, we can call it social. Yes, we can call it personal, the responsibility to finding oneself, to being oneself, and to seeing oneself in relation to other people and the world. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what I can throw back.
No, absolutely. And at this point, I think we should hear a poem. I do have a request, but I don't know, Eddie, if you had one prepared that might jive with this question of responsibility. There are a few poems in which that very word appears. But I was even thinking of perhaps starting with the title poem, Black Sand,
okay.
if you don't mind.
No. So he's asked me to read the title poem of this collection, Black Sand. So I'll see if I can find it. That's the problem about this sort of thing here now. And
page 16.
Somebody, a reviewer or commentator in the journal Small Axe, pointed out that this poem is not a complete sentence. Black sand. If the poem could open itself out and be wide as this beach of black sand, could absorb like black sand the seas, the sun's heat, and respond to bright sunlight with refractions of tone, nuances that glamour would miss. If this could happen, if the poem could yield like black sand, if you looked patiently, polished stones that fit in the palm of a woman's hand, could be cool as the sand where the wavelets splash over her feet, If the poem could be open like this beach to the breeze, like these trees that have known great winds, if the poem could be wide and open like a love that is larger than desire, larger than fear, if the poem could be patient and wide as the evening, this beach of black sand expecting the night without fear, the moon lifting over the sea, the largo of sunset spreading over the city as the jagged, wounding edges of our unworthiness are worn down by forgiveness, wave after untiring wave. The reviewer pointed out correctly, of course, that the poem is just one long conditional clause. If, so what if?
I think Eddie's throwing corn here because the reviewer happened to be sitting right here. One of the phrases in that poem is refractions of tone. Refractions of tone. And I think of your tone as one of restraint and a modest irony, but sensuous and full of compassion. In many of the poems, I think that come through. And I'm wondering what particular influences, you know, when you went to university, as you said, and the poems you started to write seriously, what particular influences you started to draw on, and the ones that you continue to return to as you write poems.
Yeah. Again, it's always easier for other people to tell me the answers to these questions. You know, very often things in my poems that I come to realize are pointed out by other people, or at least I see them in looking back. Influence. I'm supposed to be talking about this tomorrow morning, so I shouldn't say too much about this.
Oh, are you? Okay.
But
a little bit.
a little bit.
Well,
first of all, I'm, of course, a colonial product. Given my age and the time in which I went to school and so on. That was long before we attained the formal, ostensible independence. So that I was brought up, and the poetry that influenced me when I was at school in the sixth form and going into university was not West Indian poetry, hardly. You know, I'd read Claude McKay's, I've forgotten the title, about the poinsettias, red, blood red, Flameheart, and one or two other poems. But the poetry that stirred me was like the English Romantic poets, especially Coleridge and Keats, and then later on different kind of thing like Browning's dramatic monologues and so on. And then later at university, T.S. Eliot. So that's a range of influences. But then also discovering Derek Walcott at university, discovering Derek Walcott, not because I was being taught Walcott, but Walcott had just, he left Mona, he graduated, he left the campus in June of one year, and I entered in October of that year, but he was still in Kingston, and I got to know him vaguely, but I had heard his poetry on the BBC Caribbean Voices, and browsing in the stacks of the library in afternoons when art students didn't have classes, after lunch, browsing and before tea time in the stacks, going through the magazine BIM. And I remember the revelation of opening the particular number of BIM, which I can't remember offhand what number it is now, And there was the sequence of poems by Derek Walcott called Tales of the Islands. And that, as we say, blew my mind. And I even wrote a review of that number of BIM for our little student magazine, The Pelican. But the review was almost entirely about tales. A sonnet, a modified sonnet sequence where each poem was a sonnet, as it were, but really like a prose short story at the same time. So that those were some of the, so in other words, my in-betweenity was, and one of the things was obviously worked out in the teaching upbringing I'd had. But I must also say, of course, that in all the poems I've mentioned, one of the things to me that poetry, or my poetry, must have, it must have sound. I mean, that is an obvious truism. But when I'm writing a poem, for instance, I must hear it. And I must hear it in a certain way. It must have a kind of resonance, a kind of sounding depth, a kind of rhythmic flow that works itself out towards the end. So that, for instance, at school, sometimes at prayers in the morning at high school, at prayers somebody would read the lesson. And very often, looking back, I suppose, for obvious reasons, I was asked by the headmaster to read the lesson. And especially things from the book of Ecclesiastes and things like that I'd love to read. But I particularly loved to read when I was getting a cold, because my voice got a kind of depth and resonance. That's a way of talking about what I'm trying to say about me and the sound of verses. When I used to teach, and I introduced at Mona a first-year poem when we changed the syllabus called Introduction to Poetry, and I would always begin my lectures, series of lectures, by getting the students to pay attention, to think about the sound of verses. And to tell them, for instance, that we all were poets and we all love poetry. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, Humpty Dumpty, that they were listening, and what they were hearing and responding to and repeating was a rhythm, a sound.
Sound also, in the sense of being firm, the structure, you're talking about the pattern and rhythm, and thinking about your poems, you mentioned the influence of Browning and the dramatic monologue, but I'm also thinking of the way that you work in the blank verse form. And why that particular form you think that stanza pattern is the one that you seem to be most keen on?
I don't know. He's saying the blank verse form. Blank verse or a sort of modified blank verse. Sometimes I find, looking back, that many of my poems, especially later ones, are written not exactly in blank verse meter, which is a 5-beat, 5-stress line, but very often in a 4-stress line, which we'd call a tetrameter or tetrameter. And they tend to work like that with occasional rhyme. He asked me why I have a fondness for that. I suppose one answer is that it helps me. Well, blank verse, as you know, was Shakespeare and Marlowe. So that if you know the sound of Shakespearean blank verse, so that is one factor. But it also allows me to modify it towards a kind of plainness and prosaic quality, which is not prose, though, so that I can keep the resonance and the rhythm, but also very often, I hope, sound as if I'm making a plain statement. And I suppose that's one kind of answer. to why, I don't know. In other words, a poet, I imagine, just fits naturally into something that seems somehow to suit them. And he will know that, other people will know that. I have not been good at very formally patterned, you know, in like all the poems will have quatrains, 4-line stanzas rhyming A, B, A, B. Once or twice I'll do that. But on the other hand, and I'll have some free verse poems, but what I do have, what he's talking about, tends to be somewhere in between. Right. So again, in-betweenity.
Word of the day. I want to return a little bit to influences and the thing of having a cold before reciting the reading for the morning service. You're an actor and public orator of the university. I wonder too how those two things impact the poetry.
Well, I think he's asked me, he wonders how the fact that I was an actor once, long ago.
You played Malvolio once, I believe that was...
Yes, I played quite a bit of Shakespeare. I suppose what I delighted most in was Malvolio in Twelfth Night. So you see, I could be a clown too. But I played Claudius in Hamlet, but never felt comfortable because I had seen before I ever played that, the Laurence Olivier Hamlet, where Claudius is a stocky guy. And I could never feel like Claudius in my thin self. But I played Claudius and other Shakespearean roles. Yeah, but Ishion was asking, how did I see the fact that I was an actor, and I'm still inside myself an actor, as you will have noticed, and also, as he said, an orator or orator or something for the university, what's called the public orator. In other words, that is some of what I was talking about, the resonance and the rhythm in the poetry is linked to that the sound of speech, the sound of words, the sound of something constructed. And therefore, why quite a few of my poems are what we would call, following Browning, dramatic monologues, in the sense that it's not my voice, but I imagined a speaker speaking, partly or perhaps largely comes out of that because the person is performing. Like there's a poem that many people know or across the Caribbean called The Carpenter's Complaint, which because it's
we're going to hear that now. After you finish.
Because it's on the CXC syllabus, has been for years. And, you know, even at Mona, I will have a class and walking out of it, or walking out of a class, somebody coming in for another class, they hear that I'm Eddie Baugh or Edward Baugh, and it turns out the person is from Trinidad or St. Vincent or something. So you are Edward Baugh? I know your poem, The Carpenter's Complaint. So, yes. Yeah. And when I teach, the truth is, when I used to act, one would always be keyed up backstage, waiting to go on. And I never understood how any actor could act well unless they had that nervousness before. Presumably some can. But once you get on, then you take control. And teaching, lecturing, the truth is, if I may confess it, I was an actor. And sometimes lecturing, and I'd be keyed up before every lecture, still am. And sometimes I'd be going on and suddenly see a girl or a young woman down there giggling to her neighbor, the one sitting beside her. And I thought, how rude, and so. But then I realized that the giggle was about watching me act. And in a sense, it was a compliment. though not quite.
Yeah, we're going to hear. We want to do Carpenter's complaint first, please.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. Big poem. Page 120.
120?
Yeah. You want to use mine?
Asked me about this poem, and what was I writing about? That's a good question. What was I writing about? And you know, people are always curious to know the facts behind the poem. You know that, and whether it's autobiographical. Mervyn Morris has a great little poem called Data or Data, which is simply this: facts lie behind the poems, which are true fictions. Anyway, the Carpenter's complaint. Now you think that is right, sir? Talk the truth. The man was my friend. I built it. I built the house that him live in. But now that him dead, that Marga foot boy, him son, come say him want a nice job for the coffin, so him give it to Mr. Belnavis to make, that big belly crook who don't know him ass from a chisel, but because him is big shot, because him make big shot coffin, for him coffin must better than mine. Boy, it hurt me for true. Fix we a next one, Miss Fergie. That man could have knocked back him waters, you know, sir. I remember the day in this said same bar when him drink old brown and coxswain into the ground, then stand up straight as a plumb line and keel him felt hat on him head and walk home cool, cool, cool. Them was Waterbird, brother. Funeral, Misa, that boy have to know that a man have him pride. But bless me days, good enough to make him the house that him live in, but not good enough to make him coffin. I would have do it for nothing, for nothing. The man was my friend. Damn Marga foot boy. His university turned him fool. I tell you, it burned me. It burned me for true. Well, I don't like doing this, but I'll tell you. It's about me. I am the damn Marga foot boy. When my father died, which was long, long years ago, 1962, and I was the eldest child in the family, and my mother wasn't good at these things, so I was the manager of arrangements. And there was no funeral parlor in our hometown in those days, so you had to get a man to build a coffin. And I decided to use the man in the town who was quite a paunchy, very highly respected. I don't know himself as a carpenter, but he employed people, and to get them to do the coffin. And then I realized that the man who used to drink with my father in the particular bar in Port Antonio, and who built the house that we lived in from when I was 7 years old until I left Port Antonio at age 18, that the man was hugely vexed that I had done this. So that for years I lived with this inner unspoken sense of guilt and thought, so this is how poems come, and thought that I'd make it up by writing a poem. But the trouble was, years and years, and I couldn't write the poem. And I realized, looking back, when I did write it, that the trouble was I was trying to write the poem in my own voice, me speaking and saying how guilty I felt. And then you don't know where it happens or when it happens. But suddenly, one day, out of the blue like that, it clicked in my head that the speaker of this poem should then be the man who was offended. So I put him on a stool in the bar, talking to another man or two whom he perhaps doesn't even know, but where he used to drink with my father. And when he says, "Fix we our next one, Miss Fergie," actually, Miss Fergie was the actual name of the bar lady, a very respectable lady, the sister of the doctor in our town. You couldn't get a bar lady better than that. and so that's how the poem, so that's, in other words, we're talking about poetry. For a poem, I might have an idea for a poem. Very often I get a line and say, that would be a good last line for a poem. And then I wait for years before the poem comes. But what is crucial to the poem coming is that I have to find the voice. The voice, and it's when I got the voice of that man. So I think I paid my dues.
Let's continue with Port Antonio a bit, Eddie, and talk about some of your memories of growing up as a boy in that town. What's some of your most memorable moments or things that, formidable things that you can recall about being a child, a boy in Port Antonio?
Umpteen things I can recall about being a boy in Port Antonio. But perhaps what I'll just read, but it's difficult to say in what way they influence my poems. But let me just read a short poem which might kind of encapsulate.
Yeah.
This poem, Port Antonio, where he and I come from, and to his glory, we went to the same school, but not at the same time. Yes, he's a bit older than I am. But Port Antonio is in the rainiest part of Jamaica. In fact, there's a hill country village called Millbank. A few miles up, you have to pass through Port Antonio and go up into the Rio Grande Valley to Millbank. And once, as a child, quite young, I read in one textbook or other that Millbank had the second highest rainfall in the world. The place that was recorded as the highest was someplace in India. The title of this poem is A Rain-Washed Town by the Sea. It's quite short. So these are some of my memories about being a child growing up. The scrunch of the kitchen knife through the long stalks of ginger lilies I cut for my mother this leaf-moist morning. Their sharp scent pierces me. Way above the trumpet tree, noisy with the gossip of birds, improbably far, the silver stylus of a jet chalks the arrow of my ambition across immaculate blue. Even as I gaze, it dissolves in puffballs of vapor. From my school desk, carved with the names of the lost, the heroes, I shall dream on the cobalt sea.
By midday, it will rain extravagantly. The gutters will gurgle with delight. These memories define me. I keep them against that morning when my eyes no longer turn to greet the sun. So it says very little, but in a way it says it all. Particularly little different memories, but somehow I guess I was formed and the poetry came out of all that growing up in that town. I thought when Kai was doing just now that a poem that I might read was the poem called The Warner Woman.
Yes.
So can you help me? A lot of people's poems, and a lot of my poems, of course, are based on memories. And somebody wrote something about me the other day, a critical piece, in fact, a monograph, which was emphasizing this fact about memory. But can you find
109.
109. Yeah. You know Kai's novel, The Last Warner Woman? Well, in the frontispiece of that novel, he quotes most of this poem. The morning shimmers in its bowl of blue crystal. Me, underneath my mother's bed, I delight in dust and dimness. Connoisseur of comics and the coolness of floorboards, I prolong my life's long morning. But the blue sky broke. The Warner woman, bell-mouthed and biblical, she trumpeted out of the hills, prophet of doom, prophet of God, breeze blow and earthquake, tidal wave and flood. I crouched, I cowered, I remembered Port Royal. I could see the waters of East Harbor rise. I saw them heave Caneside Bridge. Dear God, don't make me die. Not now, not yet. Well, the sky regained its blue composure. Day wound slowly down to darkness. Lunchtime came, then supper time, then dream time and forgetting. Haven't heard a Warner woman these 30-odd years.
Should we turn a little bit to criticism? It's really one basic question I have, and which might annoy you as well. What is the job of the Caribbean critic?
Having spent all my life at it, I don't know. Gordon Roller is at the back. He could answer this question better. What is the job of the Caribbean? What is the job of the Caribbean critic? Well, first of all, what I've had to agonize about all the years of doing this is what is the value of the critic? What is the role of the critic? And sometimes poets don't like critics and just turn away from reading them. But it seems to me, that's a 2-minute term. It seems to me that after all is said and done, critics are useful, if not necessary. That they help at their best to act as a kind of go-between the writer and the reader who needs the help of a go-between. They help to explain, for instance, the context of the writing that the critic is writing about, where one places it, what context has fed it. And sometimes, of course, the critic, especially the critic of poetry, if the poetry is difficult, and many young people just are turned off poetry and the criticism and the study of poetry because they were not taught it well in school, I think, that's one of the large reasons. They can do with the help of the teacher or the critic who can help them to see how the poem worked. The poem is an experience. Very often when I teach, you find that you ask to read a poem and you say, what is this about? And they immediately, or they say something, they immediately go and try to sum up what they think you would tell them is the meaning of the poem. And they lose sight of the joy and the value of responding to the poem as an experience. Where are we? Where does it begin? And how does it develop? So that as a teacher of literature, who is necessarily a critic, it seemed to me that I was helping somehow, I hoped I helped somehow, to get some of them to appreciate that one experiences the poem before you arrive at, oh, this is the meaning that you turn out pat for the exam or the essay.
Let's open up the floor, and I'm sure there are many people with questions and could open up the conversation.
Hi. Thank you. I have one very straightforward question, but first I just want to testify that when you were teaching 19th century poetry, I giggled in the class. And the reason I giggled was because you were reading the thing from Lamb with a crackling. Yes. And I was waiting now to hear something profound about Wordsworth and so on. And this crackling thing was just, it took you so, your rendition of it, took us so deeply into the experience of something that seemed, that you were supposed to have known about before. You never felt it from that angle before. And I think that is the case of the performance. But it was a performance that took you straight into something that you had encountered over and over and never really experienced in that way before. So thank you for the crackling. One of the things that did, though, was that when you went into the criticism, it was very much you very much felt you were being taken into the experience of the poem because you had gone there via the crackling. But the question that I had for you, Eddie, is that so much poetry is inaccessible to most people. And your poetry is so accessible, you feel as if anybody can read it and experience it. And I'd like to know, I don't want to ask why yours is like that, but why isn't there more like that? Just a few thoughts on that, if you would.
Yes. Of course, Barbara, you're absolutely right. All I can say is that my poetry,
Hold up the mic.
all I can say is that my poetry is the way it is. But I can say this one because this is how I prefer it to be. In other words, I would like to reach people, but not reach people in this most sort of commonplace, trite kind of way, but to even say something interesting or even puzzling or even complicated, but in a way that they could understand. So that's something built into me. And sometimes I feel I'm deficient because I haven't written more complex and more difficult poetry.
Let me No. Eddie, I'm sorry to cut in there because your poem holds, from the poems I adore, they convey that thing of the simple, sensuous, and passionate music that you have described in say Walcott's work or something, and I think you sweat over them. I can tell the chiseled beauty of those work. So even I don't know, accessible is a word I struggle with. And there's a way in which, yes, you can enter these poems, but there is yes, something complex radiating in them that I don't think anyone can just write it sitting down one day just so. So that's the brilliance of Eddie's work.
Well, I should hope not that anyone can just write it. That anyone can just write it sitting down there one day. Anyway, I think we have I don't know if there's somebody else.
More questions? With Carolyn?
Thank you. Unlike Barbara, I wasn't a giggler, but I just want to say, on behalf of so many of your students, we are so happy you didn't go into poetry full time, because we would have lost the brilliance of your teaching. And those poems, they are enough for us. But no, you can still write some more.
I hope. I shall try. I shall try. Thanks.
And we are back there.
I just want to comment a bit on this question of accessibility and inaccessibility. Poetry largely functions through metaphor, and if the reader cannot apprehend the metaphor, the reader is not going to get into the poetry. So I'm really defending what can often be called difficult poetry. That's what I wanted to say.
Okay, yeah, and just a sort of quick comment on that. The writer in the world whose work I know most and best is Derek Walcott. That's how things have turned out. And I've taught Walcott's poetry here and there and over and over. And of course, a crucial thing about Walcott is his brilliance with metaphor. And the crucial factor in teaching a Walcott poem usually is to get the student to see that they must read through the metaphor and experience it and see how metaphor connects with metaphor and how there is this, so that it's absolutely true. And of course, that's a kind of complexity and can be more complex in some than in others. But it's crucial, what you say. And there are some fine poems written without metaphor in the world. But it seemed to me that, I mean, I once published an essay called Metaphor and Plainness in the Poetry of Derek Walcott, which was talking about how he can move to a kind of plainness and in a kind of plainness, but it's interacting with the metaphorical obliquity.
More questions? If Sean?
Who is he?
Sean.
Thank you.
Sean?
I'm even younger than both of you. You know, we were talking about meaning just now, as opposed to the experience or the sound of work. And it seems to me that it's become popular or necessary in poetry, in art, in painting now, for work to have meaning. And even beyond that, to be after a cause, to be driving some cause, or to be clever, to be doing something new. And I don't like it. But it seems to be popular. It seems to be now for work to have much value. It has to mean something. It has to drive a cause, whether it's, you know, it's black or it's feminism or it's gay or it's something.
Yes.
So I just want to get your view on whether you feel that's happening too and what you feel about it.
Okay, well, there are two different things you said about to have something new or to have some, you know, I had said that the poem must make a difference in this. In other words, one can write a poem which is expressing an idea, some truth that has been expressed countless times before, but your poem will click if it does it in some, I don't want to lay down any law or specify, but in some way that is a little different, that gives your personal, so that's one thing. But on the business about meaning, what you say has two aspects to it, you know. You say poems must have meaning. And I would say, yes, they must have meaning in the sense that when you have read a poem which is fine and you like and is good, somehow, in some way, it must mean something. But that doesn't mean that it has to be something that is advancing some particular cause or, you know, this ideological requirement that some people have of poets. No, I'm not into that. I have a poem which ends, a poem called A Way of Going. In other words, I'm not against ideology, but the idea that one boxes oneself in. Anyway, at the end of this imagined person's going, is a way of going, when he goes or she goes, free of desires and regrets and ideologies, he walked into the night and disappeared. Okay, so I quite understand your point, and I hope you understand my point.
It seems we have to disappear, but I wouldn't want to leave without first thanking Professor Baugh. Can I request 1 minute for Professor to read one of my favorite poems, Traveling Man? Traveling Man. You have it? Let me tell you. '91.
That Ishion asked me to read is called Traveling Man. And again, since I don't like talking about my poems, you know, but since I won't have many opportunities to let out this anymore. When Wayne Brown, the late Wayne Brown, first read this poem, and I showed it to him, and he published it in the Observer newspaper. He had a page or two on Sunday. He said, but this poem is about Walcott. Why don't you say for Derek Walcott? And I don't have it, but if you find that page in that day's Observer, it says under the title, for Derek Walcott. In the book, it doesn't say that. The thing is, I like not to put those things in there. I only have 1 or 2 poems, because in some respects, the reader might narrow down the poem too much. So it's just anyway. The thing is, many years ago in London, my wife and I saw Walcott's The Odyssey, a stage version by the National Theatre or the Shakespeare, one of those. And it remains one of the most moving theatrical experiences of my life. The audience was full. There were hardly any black people there beyond us. And I got the impression that Walcott wasn't there, and that many of those people didn't even know who Derek Walcott was. But they were just profoundly moved by that play. This poem is called Traveling Man. Man, you travel far. Remember those days when they praised you for what they called your simple native craft? Secure in their belief it knew its place, colonial backwaters, ramshackle, picturesque ports. But craft is craft, and a man has the pulse of the sea in his wrist, or he doesn't. So when at last they rose to cheer you, master mariner, maneuvering your craft that had encompassed the world into that port from which they once sailed to claim the world, and hailed you now as man, as craftsman, I stood in that crowd in the quayside, the only one not clapping. And anyone glancing at me then might say, but look this man, him dead or what? Him don't see history in the making? But my joy was too much for display. It needed the space of silence. Why bother to tell them I knew the place where the journey began, that you were not alone, that you brought with you a people, that you had earned the silence beyond applause.